Hello class, today we'll be talking about topic 2. This is the heart. We will continue on this theme even in topic 3 with the vasculature that will be connected to the heart, but right now we're just going to focus on the heart as an organ. So moving into some anatomy and sort of the purpose of this is the pumping of blood through various circuits. And so the first circuit is the pulmonary circuit. And essentially, it's receiving deoxygenated blood from the body, sending it to the lungs, and then sending it back to the heart to be pumped out to the rest of the tissues through the systemic circuit. So if you trace this on yourself, it's actually not a very long path, right? You're just going from the heart to the lungs and then back to the heart. So the pulmonary circuit, short, low pressure. But once you send that oxygenated blood back to the heart, now the left ventricle is going to send it out to the rest of the tissues of the body. So imagine that. You have to pump all the way to the top of the scalp, to the vasculature there, all the way to the bottom of your feet, to the vasculature located there. So this is a long circuit. It is higher pressure. So keep those in mind. Pulmonary circuit, short, low pressure, sending deoxygenated blood to the lungs, receiving oxygenated blood at the heart, sending it into systemic circuit, pumping from the left side to the rest of the tissues, coming back. So long and high pressure. There is a third circuit which constitutes the blood flow to the heart itself, the muscles of the heart. We'll talk about more of that in a second. So you have 4 chambers in a human heart. Certain animals have less, so certain amphibians and reptiles have 3-chambered hearts. Fish have 2-chambered hearts, for instance. But we have 4 chambers. And so really you have 2 atria and 2 ventricle. So the atria are actually the receiving chambers. And so we split those up into right and left. And the ventricles are the pumping chambers. So the right atrium's job is to receive blood from the systemic circuit, so that sort of high pressure, long circuit that's feeding the body, whereas the left atrium is receiving blood returning from that pulmonary circuit, so the oxygenated blood coming from the lungs. Now the right ventricle is pumping to the lungs, right? Is pumping through the pulmonary circuit. The left ventricle is pumping through the systemic circuit. So think about the pressures involved here. And this actually has an effect on the anatomy of the heart. When you look at a heart, the left ventricle is going to be the thickest, most muscular part. Why? Because it has to get a good pump in order to feed the entire body, essentially. So parts of the different circuits. The pulmonary circuit composes the right ventricle, pulmonary arteries, the lungs, the pulmonary veins, and the left atrium. So you can see the entire circuit through these portions here. The systemic circuit will go left ventricle through the aorta. The aorta's job is to sort of even out that blood pressure and make sure it's even through. Then to the rest of the body, it will return through the vena cava into the right atrium and then through the right ventricle, and this process just simply repeats itself. So getting into the details about the heart itself, the nitty-gritty here. It's roughly fist size, so for the average person, 250 to 350 grams. And for its size, it's actually consuming an impressive amount of blood. But it's located within the mediastinum. That will be the medial cavity of the thorax, so kind of between the lungs. And actually, we see a cardiac notch on one of our lungs to accommodate this. So it's not exactly in the middle of the chest. About 2/3 of the mass lies to the left of the midsternal line. Some people naturally have an inverted heart. We call this dextrocardia. That means right-handed heart. And essentially, when you look at the ribs, it's extending from the second rib to the 5th intercostal space, and the apex of the heart will actually contact the chest wall. And so when we talk about membranes and certain serous layers and stuff like that, really you need a lot of lubrication in instances where these organs are touching each other. But layers of the heart wall, there are 3 layers. There is the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. So the epicardium is the visceral pericardium. It is the membrane on the outside of the heart. And then you have the myocardium. Remember, myo is just a prefix for muscle. So this is the thick layer of cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is sort of unique in that it is still striated, but it has intercalated discs in between that help to link via gap junctions and basically just make sure your cardiomyocytes are getting a good even pump, a good even contraction. And then you have the innermost layer, the endocardium. And so this is also an epithelial layer. So when you look at the heart, you'll see an epithelial layer on the outside, a muscular layer that's kind of thick in the middle, and then another epithelial layer. So talking about the pericardium. The pericardium is a sac, essentially, a series of membranes that is going to surround and protect the heart and lubricate the heart. So the outermost layer is the fibrous pericardium. When you see something fibrous, its job is usually for protection, for structure. And then you'll have a two-layered serous pericardium. And so that is composed of a parietal layer, the parietal layer lining the surface of the fibrous pericardium, and then a visceral layer. So if something is visceral, it's associated with the organ. And so it's on the external surface. In this case, the visceral layer of the pericardium is the epicardium. And so the space between these two is the pericardial cavity, and this is where you're going to find serous fluid that can just help to decrease friction between adjacent organs and layers. So looking at these various layers here and their relative size, heart wall made of 3 layers, endocardium on the inside, a very thin, slippery epithelial layer, the myocardium, very thick cardiac muscle, and then the epicardium, which is also a slippery epithelial layer that's just acting as the visceral layer here. And so there's a fluid-filled sac on this side, filled with serous fluid in the pericardial cavity, just meant to reduce friction. So we're seeing that here. You have a tough and sort of structural fibrous layer that's meant to provide resistance and provide protection, and then the parietal layers and serous layers. Okay, moving on to chambers and vessels. And so we'll talk more about vessels in topic 3, but there are some important vessels that are interacting with the heart in order to accomplish the job of getting the blood out into the body. And so 4 chambers, 2 atria, which are superior, so they're above, and then the ventricles, which are inferior. Atria are actually a little smaller. The ventricles are doing most of the work, so they're much larger. The atria themselves are separated by a septum. This septum needs to close up during fetal development. If it does not, we call it, we'll talk about it at the end of the lesson, but there's a foramen ovale of the fetal heart that needs to close up. Otherwise, you'll get leakage between the two. And so that remnant is called the fossa ovalis. You can see that in adults. And then similarly, the ventricles are separated by a septum as well, the intraventricular septum. And so keep that in mind. If you have a septum to separate, of course, in this instance, you wouldn't want unoxygenated blood mixing with the oxygenated blood. So going into more details, atria, their job is just to receive blood. So they're small, they're thin-walled. They're not actually doing a whole lot for the propulsion of the blood throughout the body. That's the job of the ventricles. So the right atrium, that's where the deoxygenated blood from the body is coming in. It's getting emptied into by 3 veins: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. So when you look at the body, the superior vena cava is returning blood everywhere above the diaphragm. The inferior vena cava is returning blood from below the diaphragm. And then you have a coronary sinus, which is returning blood from the coronary veins. And so these are more responsible for like feeding the heart. Then you have the left atrium. So the left atrium is going to receive the oxygenated blood coming off of that pulmonary circuit. And the 4 pulmonary veins located on the posterior side of the heart are actually going to return that blood from the lungs. And so from the left atrium, we're moving into the left ventricle. That's where you're going to get your big pump. So the ventricles are the discharging chambers. They're the muscular chambers that are helping to push blood throughout the body, and they actually make up most of the volume of the heart. When you look at the heart, thick walls, because that muscular layer is just so thick, they serve as the pumps. The right ventricle is pumping into the pulmonary trunk, into the pulmonary circuit. The left ventricle is pumping into the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body and is really just kind of regulates the force of that pump. Now, there are many valves located along this system, and really their job is to prevent any type of backflow. They're going to respond to pressure differentials, but there are 2 different types of valves depending on how many cusps they have. Cusps are sort of like flaps that close together. You have the atrioventricular valves, so between the atria and the ventricles. 2 kinds, the tricuspid, tri meaning 3, so it has 3 cusps, and the mitral valve, sometimes called the bicuspid, because it has 2 cusps. So the tricuspid lies between the right atrial and ventricle, so on the right side. The bicuspid lies between the left atria and ventricle, so on that left side. So these are helped along by the chordae tendineae. These are connections attached to these small papillary muscles, and basically they're going to prevent cusps from turning back into the wrong side during contraction, the wrong side being that atrial cavity. And really this just goes back to this idea of try to prevent as much backflow as possible, just to prevent from double pumping the same blood. Okay, so the atrioventricular valves, that is one type of valve. The other type is the semilunar valves. And so these are going to be located between the ventricles themselves and the arteries that they pump to. And so the pulmonary semilunar valve, as the name implies, is between the right ventricle and that pulmonary trunk that it pumps to. The aortic semilunar valve is located between the left ventricle and the aorta. So keep in mind where these valves are actually located. So you've got one separating right atria from right ventricle. You've got one separating left atria from left ventricle. You've got one separating right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk, and you've got one separating the left ventricle from the aorta. So I hope that makes sense. Here is animation. Okay. So this is demonstrating how the chordae tendineae actually work. So when slight blood pressure from both directions keeps the atrioventricular valves closed like this, the papillary muscles are actually relaxed. And you can see these chordae tendineae linking to parts of the cusp. When the atrial contraction forces the valves open, that chordae tendineae actually relaxes. And so these that are normally taut now go slack. The valve closes from the ventricular blood pressure, and the papillary muscles, which had been relaxed in this state, now pull on those chordae tendineae to prevent them from prolapsing. And this is just allowing you to open those atriums without allowing a bunch of blood flow through. Essentially ensuring one-way blood flow. And this anatomy is required because there's pressure on both sides of this valve. So what happens if this mechanism does not work as well as it's supposed to? Well, leaky valves are just a consequence of old age and sometimes disease, but they will hamper cardiac function because you're having to pump that same blood twice as that blood backflows. And it doesn't matter if it's oxygenated or not, you're just not getting it through the valve. It's just leaking back. In some cases, you'll have an instance like stenosis where either due to ion deposits or perhaps fibrosis from scar tissue, a valve flap becomes too stiff and will actually constrict that opening. In some cases, we can actually repair those valves So animal tissues have been used successfully. You can use donor human tissues as well. And then there are some synthetic options, I believe. In the future, we may be able to grow our own tissue. There still needs to be a lot of work done with this, but we've seen some very promising results about regrowing at least organs and tissues, at least, maybe not at the organ level. Okay, so an important part of this lesson is tracing the path of blood through the heart. So we're just going to arbitrarily start on the right side of the heart. So remember, there are 3 places where blood is entering in through that right heart. Superior vena cava for above the diaphragm, inferior vena cava for below the diaphragm, and then the coronary sinus is draining those coronary veins. That goes to the right atrium. That blood will pass through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will, of course, contract and pump through the pulmonary supralunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk diverges into the pulmonary arteries, which leads to the lungs. And so this is where the blood is, of course, getting oxygenated. Now, once that blood is oxygenated, it's going to come in through those 4 pulmonary veins on the posterior side of the heart. From there, it's going to enter into the left atrium, the receiving chamber, pass through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will contract, this is our high pressure contraction, pushing through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. The aorta will kind of even out that pressure and send the blood into systemic circulation. So there's a picture of what it looks like, some figures. Now, talking about the pathway of blood through the heart, just in sort of review: pulmonary circuit, short, low pressure circulation; systemic circuit, long, high pressure. The anatomy of these ventricles will reflect the differences. So when you look at the left ventricle, the walls itself are up to 3 times larger than the right side of the ventricle. And that's just because it's pumping with so much more force. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the third type of circulation. So the other type of circulation that needs to be discussed is coronary circulation. So this is what is actually feeding the heart muscle itself. So the heart muscle isn't getting any of the blood necessarily that it's pumping off those first 2 circulations. It needs its own supply to be sort of shunted off when the heart is relaxed. It's very important. So this is the functional blood supply. It is actually the shortest circulation and is delivered when the heart is relaxed. Most of that is coming from the left ventricle. Most of that because think of where the need is the greatest, right? Where the muscle is the thickest. So the coronary arteries are, in a sense, delivering this blood. And so in terms of arteries and veins, that sounds backwards, right? Arteries deliver blood away from the heart to the rest of the body. Veins bring blood back to the heart. Well, in this case, coronary arteries supply blood to the heart. And in this case, these arteries contain many junctions. The anatomical term for this is an anastasome. You see anastosomes in other places as well. It just means a junction, but it just provides additional routes for blood delivery. In this case, if you have some type of blockage, it's not going to be sufficient though. You can't force enough blood through the junctions to actually accommodate a coronary artery occlusion. So, as mentioned before, the heart only being fist-sized, 250 to 300 grams, it's very impressive that it's actually consuming about 5% of the body's blood supply. But think of how often it's pumping and how hard it's working. Okay, and so here they're showing us the major coronary arteries. So the right coronary artery, the right marginal artery going across, posterior intraventricular artery, anterior intraventricular, circumflex, and left coronary. So, arteries are backwards in the coronary section. What about veins? Well, sure enough, the veins are going to move blood away from the heart in this case. The coronary veins and the cardiac veins are collecting blood from the capillary beds, delivering it to a sinus. Anytime you see a sinus, you're basically emptying something there, a fluid. In this case, it's the sinus itself is emptying into the right atrium, and this is formed by the merging of these cardiac veins. So the great, the middle, and the small. The great cardiac vein is the anterior intraventricular sulcus. The middle cardiac is the posterior intraventricular sulcus, and the small cardiac veins form the inferior margin. And so you can see these here. These are the veins of coronary circulation. The great cardiac, the coronary sinus, the middle cardiac, the small cardiac. So all of these are draining into this sinus here. So moving blood away from the muscles that are actually using them. So in coronary circulation, arteries are delivering to the heart, and then when that blood is used, veins are drawing it away from the heart. So moving into some histology. We call cardiac myocells myocytes, muscle cells. In cardiac muscle is a unique type of muscle tissue. Remember, we have two others, skeletal and smooth, but cardiac is unique because it is striated. It's very branched, and these branches are interconnected. And so when you look at it, you'll be able to tell that on the histology. One central nucleus, usually you can see binucleated cardiac muscle, but it's not as severe as like in skeletal muscle where you see those multinucleated cells. What you do see in cardiac muscle is lots of mitochondria. So remember, mitochondria are the organelle where aerobic respiration is taking place and electron transport chain and stuff like that. So this is energy being generated. And so 25 to 35% of the cell volume of a myocyte is going to be composed of these large mitochondria. And so this is how the heart can continue to beat. It's just continuously synthesizing ATP. One other thing to note is that these myocytes are joined by intercalated discs. And so intercalated discs have a particular type of junction called a gap junction, which can electrically connect the myocytes. They allow for the passage of ions. And then you have another type of junction called a desmosome. A desmosome, in this case, is sort of like an anchor point. It helps to anchor adjacent cells together, basically keeping them from pulling apart as the heart contracts. Yeah, here we go. Intercalated discs, they connect adjacent cardiac cells. The desmosome is the sort of anchor point, keeping the cells together. The gap junction allows for ions to pass, and this allows for a functional sync. Basically, the heart will beat as a single coordinated unit because the gap junctions allow for ions to pass through freely. So, comparison here of cardiac and skeletal muscle. Well, of course, because of the linking of the gap junctions, the heart, the cardiomyocytes will actually contract as a unit in a functional sync. And it's kind of an all or none thing as well. This just ensures that there is an effective pump each cycle. Meanwhile, skeletal muscles are contracting independently. And so both of these are mediated by calcium ions, but in the case of the cardiomyocyte, it's from the influx of calcium from the ECF, release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Depolarization is going to open those ion channels in the sarcolemma, and thus the ions will enter the cell. And so it's extracellular, entering the myocyte, then causing a release of this sort of internal calcium as well. And so calcium will move through the gap junction into the adjacent myocyte. Skeletal muscles, on the other hand, are not using extracellular calcium to sort of cascade these effects. So cardiac muscle uses calcium from the ECF to begin the sort of steps needed to form a contraction. So this starts off with, in this case, they're saying a nervous signal, but we'll see where there are some areas of control within the heart itself. But calcium moves into the intercalated disc, passes through that gap junction into the next cell, then the contraction will be triggered in the next cell, and the calcium ions will continue to move and follow that gradient, essentially, through cells that do not have the calcium. And so when I mentioned before that cardiac cells were branched, this is kind of what I was alluding to. They're branched and interconnected like this, basically just to allow for even flow of those ions, as well as when they pump, to pump in a functional sync. I don't know why it's so many clicks to get through this one image. Okay. So this is an electrical process, and essentially the heart is depolarizing and then contracting, and it's doing all this without nervous system stimulation. So even though there are control centers in the nervous system that help to regulate the heart itself is doing a lot of its own policing here. And so this coordinated heartbeat, which is necessary for us to live, is due to a couple things. Of course, the presence of the gap junctions linking the adjacent cardiomyocytes, that's very important. But there's also an intrinsic cardiac conduction system that is helping to keep our pace. And so we have special pacemaker cells that are setting the rhythm of these contractions of the heartbeat. They initiate and distribute impulses, basically allowing for even depolarization and contraction of a heart based on a rhythm. So there are two components here. The first is the sinoatrial node, the SA node, otherwise known as the pacemaker. And then there's the atrioventricular or AV node, which sort of helps to regulate. And so the pacemaker is located in the right atrial wall. It depolarizes faster than the rest of the myocardium, and really these things have to happen in a process, but it's generating impulses about 75 times a minute. We call that the sinus rhythm. The impulse, which is electrical in nature, will spread across the atria into the AV node. So the AV node is located in the inferior septum, and it delays those impulses. And this just allows time for the atrium to contract before the ventricles does. So it slows down the signal enough so that those superior chambers contract before the inferior chambers do. And so it has an inherent rate of 50 beats per minute in absence of the SA node's input. The atrioventricular bundle, the bundle of His, is one of the organs of the intrinsic conduction system. It's located in the interventricular septum, and it's the electrical connection. So this is sort of the wiring between the atria and the ventricles. The atria and the ventricles themselves are not linked by gap junctions. So even though it is sort of a muscular tissue there, they're not linked. And you also have the right and left bundle branches. These two pathways are located in the intraventricular septum, so separating the ventricles, and they will carry impulses towards the top of the heart, the apex of the heart. So the pace of your heart is controlled locally, but there are ways to modify and control the heart coming from other places in the body. And so in this case, it's modified by the autonomic nervous system via the cardiac centers in the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata, sort of a primordial part of the brain, usually in charge of pretty important stuff. And so being able to control your heartbeat is also pretty important. So two parts here, you'll have a cardio-excitatory center and a cardio-inhibitory center. So the cardio-excitatory center, controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, so fight or flight, increases both the rate and the force of the contractions. It does so by stimulating the sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes, the heart muscle itself, and the coronary arteries. So we're sending a bunch of blood to feed the heart. We're also increasing the force and rate of the contractions. We're trying to get blood to as much of the body that's not the digestive system, because we're getting ready to either run or fight. Then you have the cardio-inhibitory center, controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. So we would associate this with rest and digest. It's going to decrease the heart rate via the vagus nerve, and it does so by inhibiting the sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes. So as a result, you'll see basically a calming down of the body as the body uses more of that blood to deliver nutrients and oxygen to the digestive system. So just reviewing some of these mechanisms. I need to take the click function out of this. So control of heart rate then will be both intrinsic, controlled locally, and extrinsic, so controlled by the nervous system, for instance. You have the sinoatrial node maintaining the base rate, and then you have the atrioventricular node basically regulating it. So if the SA gets too fast, the AV will try and slow that signal down. And really, again, the purpose of that is so that your atrium finish contracting before your ventricles contract. Then you have the cardiovascular centers of the medulla oblongata, the cardioinhibitory and the cardioacceleratory, basically allowing you for different responses based on whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. So fight or flight versus rest and digest. And so those are controlled by spinal nerves, which are sympathetic in nature, and then the vagus, which is parasympathetic in nature. So events of the heart. This is going through a cardiac cycle essentially. We call systole the period of heart contraction and diastole the period of heart relaxation. When you're taking your blood pressure, you're actually measuring your systole and diastole. And it's a ratio. They're putting them in a ratio. But the cardiac cycle then is blood flow as it travels through the heart during one complete heartbeat. So going from relaxed to contracted. And so remember that the relaxed state is actually when the coronary circuit is feeding the heart muscles that blood. So talking about some embryological developments of the heart, there are two fetal heart structures that sort of bypass pulmonary circulation. And you have to think it's because of the fetus needing nutrients and oxygen exchange from the mother. So the heart hasn't completely developed yet. It doesn't have a functioning pulmonary circuit to actually pull oxygen from the atmosphere like an adult would. So the fetus itself is having to get oxygen from the mother through the umbilical, but there are some fetal aspects that need to develop, otherwise the child might not develop correctly. And so the foramen ovale is an opening that connects the atria. That foramen needs to close up and become the foramen, I think it was ovalis, and basically you don't want blood leaking between the two atria. There's also the ductus arteriosus, and so that connects the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. So think about that, right? The right ventricle is pumping to the pulmonary trunk, the left ventricle is pumping to the aorta. This thing is linking them. And so that needs to close shortly after birth, otherwise you're going to have a problem. You're going to have unoxygenated blood mixing with oxygenated blood. Anyway, that is topic 2, the heart. We will continue on with topic 3, I believe, vasculature and lymphatics.